Breaking news, the political earthquake no one saw coming has just ripped through Downing Street. In an unprecedented diplomatic confrontation, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has publicly slammed Keir Starmer in a fiery statement that has sent shockwaves across Britain's political establishment. The world watched in disbelief as Modi, known for his calculated composure, accused the UK Prime Minister of betrayal over a major trade deal that was secretly shelved at the last minute. Within hours, global media outlets ignited with headlines accusing Starmer of deceit, dishonour and destroying one of Britain's most vital post-Brexit alliances. What was meant to be a moment of triumph for the UK's global trade ambitions has spiralled into one of the most humiliating diplomatic collapses in modern British history. Reports suggest the confrontation erupted after months of behind-the-scenes negotiations between London and New Delhi over what was promised to be a landmark UK-India trade agreement. For both nations, it was more than economics. It was a symbol of post-Brexit sovereignty and mutual respect between two great democracies. Yet according to explosive leaks from within the Indian delegation, Starmer's government deliberately inserted last-minute conditions designed to restrict India's access to British markets while quietly demanding massive concessions in return. Modi's team reportedly viewed this as nothing short of treachery, a betrayal of every promise Britain had made. The fallout was instant. At a press conference in New Delhi, Modi's tone turned cold and defiant. He declared that India will not be lectured or manipulated by a nation that cannot honour its word. His words hit like thunder. Across Westminster, ministers froze. The Foreign Office scrambled to contain the storm, but the damage was already done. India's trade representatives immediately withdrew from talks, and the Indian Parliament erupted in applause. For a nation that prides itself on diplomacy and strategic partnership, this was a brutal humiliation for Britain, and for Starmer, a catastrophic failure of leadership. What makes this crisis even more explosive is what followed. Indian media released what they claimed were private diplomatic memos, allegedly showing that Starmer's cabinet viewed India as a secondary partner, a phrase that has infuriated millions across the Commonwealth. The documents, if genuine, portray a government drowning in arrogance, using Britain's fading colonial superiority as a weapon of negotiation. Within hours, the phrase, "Starmer betrays India," began trending across both British and Indian social media. In Delhi, protests broke out outside the British High Commission. In London, Indian business leaders accused the government of economic racism and demanded an immediate apology. But instead of calming the flames, Starmer's reaction only poured petrol on the fire. In a hastily arranged statement, he described the incident as a miscommunication, dismissing Modi's anger as political theatre. That single phrase detonated across the diplomatic world like a grenade. Former ambassadors called it the most tone-deaf response imaginable. Even Labour MPs privately admitted it was a disastrous move. By the following morning, British exports to India were already being delayed at ports. Indian investors were pulling back from London's financial sector, and opposition leaders were calling for a full inquiry into the trade collapse. Behind closed doors, panic spread through Downing Street. Advisors warned that if India officially suspends all trade negotiations, the financial blow could cripple Britain's fragile post-Brexit recovery. Economists are already warning that the collapse could cost thousands of UK jobs in manufacturing, pharmaceuticals and tech. And yet, as public outrage grew, Starmer appeared unmoved, confident, even dismissive. Insiders say he believes India will come back to the table, unaware of how deeply this insult has cut. What he didn't anticipate, however, was Modi's next move, one that would change everything, because while Starmer downplayed the row, Modi was preparing a direct and public retaliation. Within hours, India's government announced a complete review of all trade relations with Britain, a move unseen since the end of colonial rule. But it didn't stop there. Indian state broadcasters began airing special segments exposing what they called Britain's betrayal and hypocrisy, while government spokespeople accused the UK of acting like a modern empire in disguise. The tone was unmistakable. This was not diplomacy, it was war by words. Across the Commonwealth, other nations took notice. Australia and Canada expressed concern. Even the US State Department issued a statement urging both sides to de-escalate. Yet among British voters, anger was mounting for a different reason. Many saw the crisis as proof that Starmer's government had lost control of foreign policy. And worse, lost the moral compass that once defined Britain's role in the world. The idea that the Prime Minister would risk decades of friendship with one of the world's fastest growing powers for short-term political gain felt like a betrayal not only of India, but of Britain itself. Now questions are exploding across every media outlet. What exactly did Starmer's team hide from Parliament? Who authorised the secret trade conditions that triggered this outrage? And most importantly, can Britain repair the damage before it's too late? Because as it stands tonight, a furious India has turned its back on Britain. Foreign investors are in retreat, and Starmer faces what could become the most dangerous diplomatic crisis of his career. But this story is far from over. Leaks emerging from inside Whitehall hint that there's far more beneath the surface. A web of secret communications, hidden deals, and powerful donors who may have pushed Starmer to sabotage the India deal for their own interests. And if those allegations prove true, the scandal won't just destroy one trade partnership. It could bring down an entire government. As the fallout deepened, Britain's political and diplomatic machine began to convulse under the pressure. By dawn, the corridors of Whitehall buzzed with panic. Civil servants whispered of an internal crisis spiralling out of control, of missing files, encrypted messages, and furious phone calls between Downing Street and the Indian High Commission. The Foreign Office was reportedly in meltdown. One diplomat described the atmosphere as worse than Brexit night, and another said it felt like watching Truss collapse in real time. Every hour brought new revelations, each one more damning than the last. Then came the leak that turned a political scandal into a full-blown national crisis. A set of internal briefing documents, allegedly from the Department for Business and Trade, surfaced online through an anonymous whistleblower. The files painted a picture of deliberate deception, showing that Starmer's inner circle had indeed instructed negotiators to limit India's leverage by inserting hidden tariffs and export controls while simultaneously planning to blame domestic economic challenges for any fallout. In one chilling line, a senior advisor wrote, Modi will never walk away, but they need us more than we need them. That single sentence spread across every major news outlet in minutes, fueling outrage both in Britain and abroad. India's response was immediate and ruthless. Within hours, Modi's government suspended all bilateral trade talks indefinitely. Indian media framed it as Britain's betrayal of the century, while social platforms erupted with fury. Hashtags like hashtag boycott British goods and hashtag Starmer betrayed India dominated global trends. The symbolic impact was devastating. British luxury brands, fashion houses and tech firms reported plummeting orders from Indian clients. The image of Britain as a trustworthy ally, one built painstakingly over decades, began to crumble before the world's eyes. In London, opposition figures seized their moment. Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and several senior Conservative MPs united in condemnation, calling Starmer's handling of the crisis arrogant, deceitful and dangerously naive. Farage, never one to waste an opportunity, declared on live television that Starmer has turned Britain's oldest friend into its fiercest critic. Even Labour loyalists grew silent as public anger swelled. Polls released by morning showed a 12-point collapse in support for the government. Across social media, memes compared Starmer to Tony Blair, not for his charisma, but for his perceived betrayal of national trust. But behind the political theatre, a darker truth was beginning to emerge. Independent journalists started connecting dots between Starmer's failed trade deal and a small network of powerful donors. Global financial groups with vested interests in keeping the UK tied to European markets rather than forging stronger partnerships with Asia. According to these reports, lobbyists had pressured Downing Street to delay trade expansion with India to preserve influence in Brussels. If verified, that revelation could prove catastrophic. It would mean the Prime Minister had not simply mishandled a deal, he had sabotaged it under the influence of foreign financiers. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was said to be icy. Sources close to the royal household revealed that King Charles was deeply troubled by the diplomatic rupture. For decades, the monarchy had played a quiet but vital role in maintaining warm Commonwealth relations, particularly with India. To see that bond shattered by political vanity reportedly left the king furious and humiliated. Royal advisers began discreetly contacting senior Indian officials, offering reassurances that the Crown's respect for India remained unshakable. But by then, Modi's silence had grown ominous. In New Delhi, the Indian Parliament opened its session with thunderous applause as members praised Modi's firm stand against Britain. Commentators described it as a moment of national pride, the day India finally stood up to what they called British arrogance. What began as a trade dispute was quickly morphing into something far larger. A reckoning with the lingering shadows of empire. Analysts warned that this could permanently alter the balance of power between London and New Delhi. For the first time in modern history, India held the upper hand, and the world was watching. Inside Downing Street, Starmer's team tried desperately to rewrite the narrative. They issued statements insisting Britain remained committed to fair partnership and claimed the leaked documents were taken out of context. But it was too late. The damage had metastasised. Every attempt to explain sounded like another lie. Even mainstream outlets that had once defended the Prime Minister began turning against him. The BBC described the situation as the greatest diplomatic failure of the decade. The Times published an editorial titled "The Betrayal of a Commonwealth Ally." In Parliament, Starmer faced calls for an emergency inquiry into his conduct, while MPs shouted, "Resign!" across the chamber. And yet, through all of it, one question lingered. Why? Why would a Prime Minister risk alienating one of Britain's strongest partners at such a fragile time for the nation's economy? Some said it was arrogance. Others whispered of external pressure, that powerful global interests were shaping government policy behind closed doors. A few even claimed Starmer's advisers had underestimated India's resolve, believing Modi would quietly concede. But Modi did not bend, he stood firm, and Britain now stood isolated. As night fell over London, the city seemed eerily quiet. Television screens across the nation replayed Modi's speech, his words echoing like judgment. India will trade with those who honour their word, not those who disguise deceit with diplomacy. It was more than a rebuke, it was a warning. And in that moment, millions of Britons began to realise that something far greater was unravelling. Not just a trade deal, but Britain's moral credibility on the world stage. By the third day, the diplomatic shock had morphed into a full-scale political meltdown. Britain was no longer simply embarrassed. It was cornered. International allies began to question Starmer's judgment, while the domestic press portrayed him as a man adrift in his own arrogance. The scandal that began as a trade dispute now resembled a slow-motion implosion of credibility. In the eyes of millions, Starmer had not only insulted India, that he had undermined Britain's place in the world. Parliament convened in emergency session as MPs demanded answers, but Starmer appeared defiant, refusing to take full responsibility. When asked if he would apologise to Prime Minister Modi, he coldly replied that Britain acts in its own best interests. The chamber erupted in outrage. That single sentence would come to haunt him. The political fallout deepened when new revelations surfaced. Investigative journalists uncovered a confidential financial trail linking several of Starmer's key donors to multinational firms with heavy European interests, companies that had allegedly lobbied to stall the UK-India deal. The documents showed that meetings took place in London's private clubs, hidden from public records, where officials discussed how to keep Britain aligned with European trade standards. It was no longer speculation, it was evidence of manipulation. By evening, the headlines were brutal. Starmer's secret donor network. Did he betray Britain for Brussels? The opposition seized on the story, demanding a criminal inquiry into foreign influence at the heart of government. Meanwhile, economic pain began to bite. The pound slipped sharply as investors fled uncertainty. Indian tech firms withdrew from joint ventures, citing instability and distrust. Major British exporters, from pharmaceutical giants to manufacturing hubs in Birmingham and Manchester, started reporting cancellations worth millions. Unemployment warnings loomed. The very industries Starmer had promised to revive under his leadership were now being crippled by his own diplomatic blunders. Public anger reached boiling point. Outside Downing Street, protesters gathered waving both the Union Jack and the Indian tricolour, united in outrage. Their chants were simple, furious and unrelenting. Starmer must go. Within the palace, King Charles watched events unfold with growing concern. Courtiers described the monarch as gravely disappointed at the government's behaviour, while the king remained constitutionally neutral. His silence carried weight. Behind closed doors, senior royal advisers urged Starmer to issue a formal apology to India to restore dignity and stability. Yet the Prime Minister refused. He was said to be furious that the monarchy would dare to intervene, claiming the crisis was being politicised by the Crown. That internal tension between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace added a new layer of national unease, the feeling that Britain's unity itself was fracturing. Then came the moment that shattered any illusion of control. Late that week, the Indian government announced sweeping economic restrictions against British goods. Tariffs, export bans, and the suspension of visa fast tracks for UK citizens. It was the harshest diplomatic response India had ever taken against a Western ally. Overnight, flights were cancelled, investments froze, and panic gripped financial markets. Commentators compared the collapse to the Suez moment, a modern reckoning of arrogance and consequence. Even the usually reserved Financial Times declared Starmer's foreign policy has detonated Britain's post-Brexit credibility. The words echoed like a verdict. Inside Labour ranks, rebellion brewed. Senior MPs began whispering about a leadership challenge. Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner reportedly confronted Starmer in a tense private meeting, warning that the party's image was burning alive. Cabinet leaks described shouting matches, slammed doors and calls for emergency reshuffles, but it was too late. The public had already turned. Polling across the country showed record lows for Labour. Even traditional supporters in London and Manchester expressed shame over what they called the betrayal of a friend and partner. The moral outrage was no longer confined to politics. It had seeped into the soul of the nation. And in India, Modi's popularity soared. Crowds gathered outside Parliament chanting his name, praising him for standing up to British hypocrisy. Commentators called it a defining moment in India's rise, the day it broke free from Western condescension once and for all. Modi's approval rating skyrocketed. India's news anchors spoke of a new era of independence, while Britain's media painted a portrait of decline, a powerful nation humbled by its own deceit. The contrast could not have been sharper, a leader standing firm in principle and another collapsing under his own pride. By the end of the week, Starmer's isolation was complete. European leaders distanced themselves quietly. Washington remained silent, and Commonwealth partners froze communications. Every diplomatic door seemed to close at once, and the Prime Minister's statement the following day was brief and emotionless, and he announced a temporary suspension of all trade talks with India, insisting relations would stabilise in time. But no one believed him. The public saw through the calm tone. It was the language of defeat. Now, the once celebrated reformer of British politics stands on the edge of his downfall. Critics call it poetic justice. The man who promised global respect has delivered only global embarrassment. The scandal has exposed more than poor diplomacy. It has revealed a moral void at the heart of leadership. The question echoing through Britain tonight is no longer about trade or policy. It is about trust. Can a nation built on centuries of honour survive when its leaders forget the meaning of integrity? As the lights of Downing Street burn into the night, whispers of resignation grow louder. India has turned its back, the economy trembles, and even the king is rumoured to be preparing a statement to calm the nation's unease. History may remember this as the week Britain learned the true cost of arrogance. For now, one truth stands unshaken. In his quest for power, Keir Starmer may have lost something far greater than a trade deal. He may have lost Britain's soul.